Hello and welcome to the Focusing Way podcast. I'm your host, David Battistella. Focusing practice is explored in many ways. I myself have put it to the test in every aspect of my life, time and time again. One might think that going inside is more of a spiritual or emotional practice, but one thing to remember about focusing is that it is a body practice. It's all about going within, seeking answers, and a sense of rightness that flows from within you. Focusing is a body practice. It's not meditation. We are looking for places in our body where emotional stuckness presents itself. Once we tune in, we can discover the multitude of ways our body communicates through sensations, images, and feelings throughout the body. These places tend to present themselves from the area around the throat, and I invite you to check in on that right now. Or the heart space, or the stomach, or the whole center of us. Of course, things can present in the head as a headache, the neck as neck pain, back pain, cramps, muscle soreness. It's all part of how the body talks to us. But what do? How do we focus around physical pain, the kind we might experience after major injury or surgery? What role can focusing play in the moments before, during, and after an event like this in our lives? Early on in my focusing life, I had injured my calf muscle playing squash. At the time, I thought I had been hit in the back of the leg by the racket of my squash partner. I was convinced that he had cracked the back of my calf with the snap of a bamboo rod. That, my friends, was pain. A shooting pain I'd never really felt before that moment. Thankfully, the injury did not require surgery, but it did give me the opportunity to examine the pain that was there. I did not do this in an abstract way. I used focusing techniques to get inside that injury, to be with it, to talk with it in some way, and understand some important things. One memory is something around putting your best foot forward. Another is about pushing too hard. The important thing is that through this focusing, I gained a bodily understanding of what happened, and I could take this knowledge and focusing into the healing process. I learned something more about myself, about the before and after, and about a new way of self-healing that took into account the whole. Of course, I saw doctors, homeopaths, and other experts, but I included my focusing in this healing as well. Since that time, I've applied this focusing to various scenarios, from minor headaches to flus, colds, and dental visits. Some of you might remember recent podcasts with Barbara Dickinson. I learned that Barbara was going to be having hip replacement surgery. In our conversations, I shared some ways I had used focusing around physical pain. She also agreed that after the surgery, she would share the many different ways she used focusing before, during, and after her surgery. So please sit back and enjoy part 1 of my conversation with Barbara Dickinson. And joining me now, somewhat fresh from hip replacement surgery, Barbara Dickinson. Barbara, thank you for being here with me.
Hi, David. Thank you for doing this. This is a topic that's somewhat close to home these days.
Yes, it has been for me as well in the past year or so. But let's just start today, because maybe we could talk a little bit about the lead up, about the time before surgery, and maybe let's talk a little bit about how we can use focusing in those days and weeks and hours and even minutes before having to go into surgery?
Sure. So I am not a particularly happy person going into surgery. It isn't an experience that I would say I enjoy or want to go into. And I also have a history that when I got into focusing deeply, I was able to track back to my infancy because my hip replacement story goes back that far, having been born with hip dysplasia. I was in and out of hospitals as an infant at a time when parents weren't allowed to stay over. So I was left alone. An infant like that has a sense of abandonment. And then sometimes I've tried to imagine my infant mind dealing with nurses and doctors, and they were replacing plaster casts on my hips and legs, and so they probably had to do noisy, scary things.
Yeah.
So I've been able to go through with focusing to my adulthood and understanding that I've got a very bodily feeling of fear, probably trauma, maybe even terror about medical environments. And now, of course, as an adult, I've talked myself into a more rational adult understanding of what I'm going through, but there are still times that those baby parts of me will come up and I will start to feel scared. You might say for no good reason, except that it's for very good reason.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where a focusing partnership or solo focusing keeps me going. I sometimes have been a flight risk from surgery. I've had to have friends make sure I got to the hospital. This time I was much calmer. But there were still moments when this fear came up. There have been 2 experiences in my past that made my involvements with medical people even scarier, where people took advantage of me. Mm-hmm. And then you know how it is. Your mind conjures up future scenarios. This is going to happen again. What am I going to do? That's too scary. I don't want to do this. But I needed this surgery, and I wanted this surgery. And that was part of the focusing process, was to ground myself in presence and in my desire, in my wanting to do this, and then invite the parts in that were scared, terrified, resistant, ready to flee, and let them be scared, but be with them as an adult. Remembering these are baby parts of me that have no, conscious understanding, no adult understanding of what's going on. So that was a big part of it for me, was managing what I knew would come, but still the body brings it, even if we know.
I just want to roll back a sec, and I just wanted to ask, did you discover through focusing that this was a whole underlying part of the thing you had around surgery? Or because people generally might have that innate thing, but was this something that was new when you did you discover that those younger parts of you that were maybe traumatized when you were a child, did you discover that through a focusing process?
Yes, it was focusing oriented therapy, as a matter of fact. Mm-hmm. I knew I had a really difficult experience in a hospital with surgery, with doctors, with some very abusive people in my 20s. And in my later adulthood, I believed consciously that was the source of my fears about hospitals. Mm-hmm. But using focusing and therapy, I went back a year before that incident and discovered there was some minor medical thing that went on. And I realized that in that earlier episode, I still had the same fears.
Mm-hmm.
And that meant it wasn't that horrifying thing in my 20s that happened. It was something earlier.
Yeah.
I had no medical history earlier until you got to my infancy. So it was a going backwards process till we kind of smacked into that infant experience.
So you came back through that focusing oriented therapy process into a memory of experiences you had as a child. But then through that process, maybe just walk me through how you were able to sort of be with that and bring that understanding into today.
So part of that is healing a trauma process. And we did that using focusing oriented therapy, using a technique called EMDR, which, while I can describe how EMDR affected me, I'm not qualified to describe how or why it works, but it helps you to recall. I wouldn't say necessarily relive, but recall. And what was fascinating about this particular healing is that I don't have any conscious memories of myself from age 6 months old when the casts went on my legs and hips to age 2 where they came off.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have any. Most people don't, from what I understand. So I sort of constructed what it must have been like. I'm lucky in that I had babies of my own by this time. So I had raised 2 infants, one of whom actually spent time in the hospital when he was 4 months old, not for anything like this, but I had some adult experience of the infant in that situation that I used to sort of build my own memories up of what it must have been like.
Mm-hmm. Or even just the feeling of what it must have been like, because sometimes memory just sort of presents as a really, really sort of deep sense, like something. I'll even call it a knowing, like you know something really, really deep within yourself, and you don't even quite define it. It comes partly through memory and partly through this sort of deep, deep sense of something. And it can be vague, but it can still sort of really inform, like you can still have kind of like an aha moment in there where you go, oh, right, there was that thing. And there's like dots get connected and then things are different from that moment forward. Is that kind of part of what happened there for you?
I think that describes it really well. With the help of the therapist, because again, I wouldn't really know myself, the 6-month-old mind.
Mm-hmm.
She was able to describe for me, well, a 6-month-old, a 12-month-old, an 18-month-old would likely feel this in that setting.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the combination of big, scary people, and of course, big, scary people in uniforms that were doing things to me, and I was powerless.
Mm-hmm.
So powerlessness and being afraid and the feelings that go along with this notion of abandonment. So an infant at that age wants to see their parents' face.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they're familiar with. That gives them comfort.
Mm-hmm.
And here I was, kept overnight in a hospital with no familiar face, with people doing things I not only didn't understand, but that didn't feel good and frightened me.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, I was able to comprehend, I would say bodily, what that must have been like for that infant version of me.
Mm-hmm.
And then of course, you get to do your aha moment of no wonder I would be afraid of anything medical. No wonder I would just start shaking at the gate, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
having to go into any kind of medical setting, because for me, it was evoking all of this. I mean, I think terror is a good word for this.
Yeah.
An infant would be terrified. Um,
Let's just jump ahead to this moment now, where very recently you've had a second hip procedure, and let's go to the few months, or from the time you sort of knew that you'd be going in for this. Like, how were you able to use focusing in that time, in that lead up time?
so the first part of the answer is pretty much 24/7. I was focusing one way or the other. I'm very fortunate to have a good and wide group of focusing partners, and so I kept focusing sessions on the calendar as
Mm-hmm.
often as I could, and I would use them for whatever aspect of life before surgery was presenting itself. And the rest of the time, I was attending in a focusing way, or as some people like to call it, solo focusing, with parts of me that were jumping up and down for various reasons.
Mm-hmm.
So it's funny that you put it the way you did about the time that I knew that I was going to have this procedure, because the time that I knew I was going to have this procedure goes back decades.
Right.
I've always known that I would wind up eventually getting my hips replaced. And the first one, it took 3 surgeries to get it right. The last of which was almost 3 years ago. And when I met the surgeon who did that procedure, I knew that I wanted to get him to do the other hip, and it was going. It was hurting more. My walk was getting more unbalanced and impaired. One of my indicators is if I can't sleep on that side of my body.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good, fairly early warning sign. And then I just started to do some conversations and calculations and lots of focusing to say, so when is the right time to do this? And it turned out it was now. And of course, the minute I committed to the surgery date, the fear started.
Right.
And I started working with that. But one of the things I did in a focusing way was also to focus with something that you and I had talked about
Mm-hmm.
a couple of months ago, about gratitude to my body, and specifically that hip,
Mm-hmm.
for what it had given me all these years. This is a hip that was deformed at birth, kind of forced into some sort of almost normal configuration by the early medical procedures, and I walked and ran and played and danced and climbed and fell and bicycled and did all sorts of other things, bore children for more than 60 years on that hip. So gratitude really seemed like a good approach to take. So I had a number of sessions with myself, just sitting with that hip and saying, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm so grateful.
Yeah, that was a similar experience that I had because earlier this year I had a pretty major wisdom tooth operation and impacted. But before that, even about 6 months before that, I had one upper wisdom tooth removed, and there was a lot of anxiety around that. And even though the surgeon I had for that, his nickname is the butterfly, because he has it's beautiful in Italian. They call him the farfalla, because he can sort of extract a tooth without anybody sort of knowing, like we're really feeling it. And it really was that experience. It was minutes for that particular tooth. But it had dawned on me in the anxiety and the worry and the panic and the awful feelings we experience inside before procedures. And people sometimes feel that just having to go to the dentist to have a cleaning or a hygiene, like just walking into a dentist's office. So, which I experience as well. One of the things that dawned on me was I sort of did like a whole hour like that, just on the part of me that was physically going to be removed, going to be let go, and that whole thing of gratitude, going into that, whatever role this thing has played in my whole story up to this point, I'm grateful for. And that flips the perspective in a way that is just so empowering in a way. It's just so, because it moves you right into kind of almost into healing ahead of time. And I used that same sort of more intensely with the pretty major surgery that I had this past year. And that's been a whole other process on its own. But yeah, the being grateful for is just such a powerful process.
That's exactly it. Thank you for sharing that. It brought something, I think, important about the language that we use. And of course, in focusing, we're very attentive to language. What does the focuser say? Does the listener reflect it in a way that helps the focuser? And I always say when the listener gets it wrong, that's even better than getting it right, because it brings more. And I began to notice the language that people use around this notion of I'm giving something up in the surgery, or letting something go in the surgery that doesn't work well for me anymore. And I'm not just letting something go. There's not a gap there. They're putting something else in that's even better than what I had before. And at least in the Western medicine world, in which I have been traveling lately, the notion that something that Western medicine would do is even better than what I had before is not the common vernacular. It's, we more tend to think of what doctors have to do is not as good as what we might come by naturally, but that's not me. I had 2 hips that did not serve me well after they wore out. They served me for a long time, but they hurt, they unbalanced me, they caused me a lot of difficulty, and now I've got these 2 titanium hips that work great.
Yeah.
And so I changed the language. They have you, a lot of people would have you talk about your good hip, for example, or your good leg is the one that wasn't operated on, and your bad leg is the one that was just operated on. And a while back, we started to do, there's my good leg, it's good now, and there's my operated leg. There's the one that needs some more assistance right now.
Right.
And pretty soon it'll be 2 good legs, but I started to watch language like bad leg. No, it's not my bad leg, it's my about to be great leg.
Yeah.
There's a language component that
which shifts attitude a little bit, because if you're starting to look at that leg that's about to be repaired as your soon to be good leg rather than the bad leg, that's going to be fixed, and we put these language things onto them, it just changes the whole everything. I'm sure people listening can go, yeah, like I can feel, like if you just hear, as I hear you say, it's not my bad leg, it's my soon to be good leg. That just, it's a monumental shift in attitude and thought, but that sort of permeates every cell of your body at that point. When you're holding that kind of belief, that's going right through everything in you, in the whole thing that is you, not just the hip part that is you. So I'm just wondering if you could share with me any other sort of things that came up in the the pre-phase, in the waiting, if you want to call it that, or in the was there anything that came up that struck you, that where you were sort of saying, God, I'm happy I have focusing in my life right now, we which we tend to do sort of almost daily, but was there anything like that during this time?
Oh, yes, absolutely. For one thing, I can be a bit intense in planning for things, thinking that more has to be done than maybe is necessary. And not just focusing, but my other favorite practice, interactive focusing, helped me listen to the people around me. And so I had to assemble a team of people that were going to do various things for me while I couldn't. And I could have been very directive. I could have been very intense. I can even be intimidating, if you can imagine that. And I could have alienated people that I needed to help me. And with focusing, I was able to sit with myself, sometimes before an interaction or an encounter, sometimes after, and go through, so how do I want this to go? What is it I want at the end of it? Or how did it go? Did it go the way I wanted? Did it maybe not go so well? So focusing was the central part of what do I need to get me through this experience.
Is that also, if I paraphrase what you're saying, is it also kind of a way of saying, what would be the exact right thing for me to get through this experience?
Yeah, and I would say that had a sort of a macro and a micro to it.
Mm-hmm.
What's the exact right thing I need overall in this area? So a simple example, meals.
Mm-hmm.
I was incredibly lucky that one of my sons, who is living with me, made a decision to stay home the week after my surgery. And he is a fabulous cook. And a couple weeks prior, I was fretting over how I was going to be able to prepare meals for a few days once I got home.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a plan for that, and I was working on it. And then in a conversation with him, he volunteered that he was going to stay home. And I knew enough to stop thinking about meals at that point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I could have started telling him what to do.
Yeah.
I focused with, so how do I want this to be? And what I wanted was to be able to let go and say, great, meal problem solved.
Yeah.
So that was, to me, that was kind of a micro level thing, just getting the whole eating thing done. At the more macro level, there was, how will I make sure I'm safe? I needed to rearrange things in my home a little bit to be able to stay on one floor. In hindsight, I now know that I had plans for all kinds of things that weren't needed.
Mm-hmm.
My recovery was quicker and easier than I expected, and so some of the things that I was planning, I never used them.
But did you have still, through all that sort of organizational stuff, were there some moments where it was just like, oh, I'm really afraid to do this, or those parts of you that sort of come up and can begin to, really sort of take over?
Oh, yeah. There were moments of, I'm not going to do this.
Mm-hmm.
There were a couple times I wanted to bail out. I got so frightened, and I knew that was going to happen. And I'm not going to be able to tell you that it was just focusing. There were tranquilizers involved.
Mm-hmm.
But the conversation with myself about whether this was a moment when I ought to get some extra help, like a focusing session, a nap, or a tranquilizer, was very much a focusing moment.
Sure.
And it was the same thing when we get to the post-surgery when I was in pain.
Mm-hmm.
I know people that can stay in pain, and I have been one of them, for way too long because of an internal conversation that's going on
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't have the benefit of focusing.
Right. What does that conversation sound like?
For me, the conversation is, I don't want to take a painkiller. They're too strong. I don't really worry about addiction, but there is a little tiny part of me that goes, you could get addicted.
Mm-hmm.
If we're going to talk about pain, in fact, the conversation started out as a good one. Do I need something? If I breathe into this, is it the kind of pain that's going to pass? If it's not going to pass, what do I need? Do I need the lightweight or the heavyweight? Since this wasn't a surgery that kept me bedbound or dependent on nurses, it was always a question of get yourself up and go get the pain medication. I suppose in hindsight I could have kept the pain medication by the bed, but I'm actually glad I didn't.
Mm-hmm.
I had to get up and I had to travel 20 feet to get it.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't take it frivolously, and I no longer delay too long taking it.
That sounds very interesting, and I want to talk a little bit more about pain and dealing with that pain. So stay tuned for our next episode. You've been listening to The Focusing Way podcast, available on iTunes and Stitcher. I'm your host, David Battistella. Please visit our website at thefocusingway.com.